Story 1. My name is James. At the age of 26, I arrived at the firm conclusion that I required a complete cessation from all aspects of my daily life and from every individual within it. This was not indicative of an emotional collapse or a generational turning point, but rather a profound desire for a comprehensive mental quietude. Consequently, I contemplated the idea of embarking upon a solo hiking expedition along a section of the extensive Appalachian Trail. Naturally, I had no intention of traversing its entirety. My plan involved a more achievable circuit spanning approximately 7 days, commencing in the vicinity of a minuscule settlement known as Elkridge, located within North Carolina, a short distance from the hot springs area, and then looping back towards a locality named Blinn Hollow. The chosen route appeared sufficiently isolated to guarantee minimal encounters with casual sightseers, yet remained conveniently accessible should circumstances unexpectedly become unsettling. I refrained from making an extensive announcement about my departure. I simply informed my employer that I would be taking a period of absence. To my sibling, I conveyed a brief and ambiguous message, something akin to, "Greetings, I shall be without online connectivity for a duration." And that was the extent of my communications. There were no updates posted on social media, no links for global positioning system tracking shared, nor any emotionally charged farewells. The last thing I desired was for someone to send me messages frequently, inquiring if I had achieved self-discovery. My purpose for venturing into that environment was not for such an objective. I was not seeking to mend or recover. I was merely experiencing a profound sense of exhaustion, a weariness akin to the incessant mental buzzing induced by overhead fluorescent lighting. I longed to reclaim the ability to perceive my own thoughts clearly, or ideally to experience an absence of any thought whatsoever. The initial 72 hours unfolded precisely as I had envisioned. Long, tranquil segments of pathways were enveloped by dense, verdant foliage. One begins to discern peculiar details when deeply immersed in such wooded environments, such as the surprising multiplicity of hues present in various types of moss, or the tactile sensation of arboreal bark when one fully reclines their entire physical form against it. It is as though every sensory input becomes heightened in its intensity. I experienced that particular satisfying fatigue that manifests exclusively after an entire day of strenuous walking, where one's lower limbs ache, but in a gratifying manner, as though they have successfully accomplished a commendable endeavor. I consumed those unappetizing freeze-dried culinary preparations, found slumber beneath a simple tarp shelter, purified water from flowing watercourses, observed cervine creatures on one occasion, and even managed to glimpse a large ursine animal positioned far off on a distant elevated landform. The animal did not direct its attention towards my location, and I deliberately avoided seeking out any potential dangers. I exercised caution. In retrospect, I was perhaps excessively cautious. My provisions were secured in a bear-resistant bag suspended nightly. Protocols for ensuring fire safety were meticulously observed. I conscientiously consulted topographical charts, utilized natural landmarks for orientation, and designated emergency rendezvous points. I had contingency plans for my contingency plans. Such a systematic approach provides a sense of reassurance when one is navigating the wilderness in solitude. It instilled within me a feeling of being in command of the situation. It was on the 4th night that the entire experience took a definitive turn. I established my temporary dwelling within a depression situated to the north of Devil's Thread Gap, approximately 10 miles past the central point of my planned itinerary. A dry watercourse bed was located nearby within a clearing furnished with an ample quantity of rocks to serve as a natural barrier against wind. I distinctly recall considering it an optimal location. I brought water to a boil, tore open a pre-packaged serving of powdered lasagna, which remained utterly unpalatable, and positioned myself upon a partially decayed log, engrossed in reading an electronic book on my portable device. I had only just begun to experience a sense of tranquility when it assailed me. The aroma. It was instantaneous, piercing, and chemical, reminiscent of a concoction of sanguineous fluid and acidic battery components with an underlying nuance of something putrid. It was not merely unpleasant, it was unequivocally wrong. Do you comprehend how your cognitive faculties subtly alert your primal instincts to impending peril before your rational mind fully processes the threat? That was precisely the nature of this sensation. I initially conjectured that an animal might have perished in the immediate vicinity. Consequently, I arose and executed a deliberate, unhurried examination of the surrounding area. I inspected beneath dense undergrowth, ascended a short distance to scrutinize the inclining terrain above, and investigated near the tree line. Nothing was present. No decaying remains, no scavenging birds, no discernible claw marks or tracks. Not even the slightest disturbance of the fallen leaves was evident. The environment was simply still, excessively still. I wasted no further time after that realization. I hastily consumed my provisions. I meticulously resecured my bear-proof food suspension. I enclosed myself within the confines of my tent prior to the setting of the sun. Sometime past the stroke of midnight, I became aware of rhythmic footfalls. They were unhurried, uniform, a singular step occurring at distinct intervals across dry foliage and small branches. Not frenzied, not characteristic of an animal. I have heard the sounds of nocturnal mammals such as raccoons, foxes, and even cervine creatures moving through the woods. This was unequivocally dissimilar. This was deliberate. I adopted an upright posture within my sleeping bag, remaining completely immobile. I suspended my respiration, focusing solely on the auditory input. The footsteps circumambulated my tent once, precisely one time, forming a perfect circular trajectory. Subsequently, they ceased directly behind my head. There was no rustling sound, no illuminating beam from a handheld light, no vocalization, merely an absolute silence. I refrained from unzipping my tent. I did not even permit a single muscular twitch. I maintained a firm grip on a bladed implement beneath my sleeping bag. My digits were so rigidly contracted around the hilt that my hand became desensitized. I endured the weight. I believe I maintained that motionless state until the celestial expanse began to gray and the avian creatures commenced their morning vocalizations. In the early hours, I examined the ground behind my temporary dwelling. There were impressions which were distinctly not my own. The undersides were almost entirely smooth, similar to antique leather footwear, and the front portion of the foot was angled slightly inward as though the individual's feet were naturally inverted. That minuscule characteristic profoundly disturbed me. I am uncertain as to why, but it did. It felt anomalous, as though there was an inherent irregularity in the manner by which the individual, whoever it may have been, traversed the terrain. I rapidly consolidated my belongings. I abstained from eating. I did not even engage in stretching. I simply initiated my movement and continued without cessation until my lower limbs were vehemently protesting. I bypassed my subsequent planned destination, disregarded my scheduled periods of respite, and halted only for the briefest intervals to rapidly ingest water before resuming my trek. And the peculiar odor persisted in accompanying me. It emanated in intermittent surges, occasionally faint, at other times more potent, redolent of metallic oxidation and decomposition. And something additional, something saccharine, almost viscous, akin to deteriorated produce. It defied logical explanation. Nothing deceased is capable of pursuing one for a distance of 10 miles. That subsequent night, I located an elevated position upon a ridge. The arboreal cover was sparse, affording me an unimpeded vista in every cardinal direction. I believed this might contribute to a greater sense of security. It did not. I did not ignite a fire. I did not engage in culinary preparation. I entered my tent and maintained a tenacious grip on that same bladed implement, as though it were immutably affixed to my hand. Then at approximately 2 a.m., I abruptly awoke once more. A slow, rhythmic, and distinctly human respiratory sound emanated from just beyond the demarcation of the trees. It was stationary, devoid of labored breathing, merely observing. Subsequently, the footsteps recommenced. A crunch, a pause, another crunch. There was no circling this time. They advanced directly towards the tent. I perceived the outlined form, a tall, slender figure, illuminated from behind by the lunar luminescence. It was holding an item, a branch. No, something longer, more akin to a ceremonial staff or possibly a long pole. It positioned itself just outside my tent and made a singular tap. That was all. Just one percussive sound, like an individual lightly striking a surface with their digit. Then it rotated and departed. The peculiar aroma lingered within the tent long after its departure. I failed to achieve any further slumber following that event. I did not even adopt a seated posture when the solar orb ascended. I packed my belongings within 10 minutes and proceeded along a marked shortcut I had noted on my topographical chart, a utilitarian pathway that would ultimately converge with the main vehicular thoroughfare. Around the late afternoon, with my lower limbs barely capable of further locomotion, I inadvertently encountered an antiquated hunting cabin. It was barely structurally sound, possessing only 3 walls, a partial roof, and decaying timber. I ducked inside simply to regain my breath. It was then that I observed the incised markings. Dozens of personal identifiers had been meticulously scratched into the wooden surface above the entrance. Some were initials, others complete appellations. Every single one was accompanied by a corresponding date. Some dated from prior decades, others were more recent. The most contemporary entry was from a mere 3 days prior. Beneath that specific designation was a conspicuously empty space. It was not even subtly arranged. It was merely an obvious vacant area, as though deliberately awaiting the subsequent inscription. I remained seated there, the bladed implement still clutched firmly in my hand, my cardiac organ seemingly attempting to rupture through my thoracic cavity. I spent the entirety of that night within the confines of that dilapidated shelter. I did not experience any sleep. I merely listened intently. Each instant, a sound of fracturing wood emanated from outside. I was convinced it was the entity returning, anticipating the onset of darkness, but it never reappeared. As soon as daylight emerged, I hastened down the pathway. I continued to walk until I discerned the presence of an official park ranger's utility vehicle. I likely presented an appearance akin to someone who had recently emerged from a subterranean dwelling. The ranger inquired as to my well-being. I informed him that I had encountered an ursine creature and had become disoriented while attempting to evade it. He did not press for further details. Upon my return home, I divested myself of all my outdoor equipment, including my navigational charts, my specialized footwear, and even my water purification device. I have not engaged in hiking activities since that time. Story 2. I once harbored the conviction that I possessed considerable competence within woodland environments. By no means was I an expert in wilderness survival or anything of that nature, yet I regularly engaged in camping and hiking, and I did not succumb to panic at every minor sound of a snapping twig. Therefore, when my kinsperson Ben extended an invitation for me to visit his family's property near Waverly, Virginia for a week last August, I accepted without a moment's hesitation. They possessed an expansive, rustic timber dwelling situated far beyond the periphery of anything resembling established human habitation. There were no adjacent dwellings, no cellular network reception, no pervasive artificial illumination from nearby towns. Merely an unending expanse of arboreal growth extending behind it, as though the wilderness commenced where their cultivated ground ceased and continued indefinitely. Ben and I had spent numerous summers together during our formative years. Even after our commencement of collegiate studies, we had diligently maintained this shared custom. We were both now 20 years of age, technically recognized as adults. However, whenever we reunited, our interactions invariably reverted to the familiar pattern of juvenile jesting and amicable contests concerning who could consume the greatest quantity of convenience store snacks or whose academic institution inflicted a more profound sense of existential burden. We were several days into our visit when a pervasive sense of tedium settled upon us. There was no access to wireless internet, no female companionship, and a finite limit to the duration one could engage in kart racing video games before beginning to contemplate the fundamental nature of existence. It was at this juncture that Ben introduced the topic of the elevated fire observation structure. "There's one located far beyond Ridgepoint Bluff," he casually remarked, interjecting the comment while we were midway through a midday repast of grilled cheese. "It's approximately 3 miles in. Extremely precarious, but it remains upright. You can survey the entire regional area from its summit." I paused, a morsel of food suspended midway to my oral cavity. "You've ascended it previously?" I queried. "Once, during sophomore year, we undertook a nocturnal ascent. The entire experience profoundly disconcerted me. I won't deny it, but it was also somewhat extraordinary," he replied. I elevated an eyebrow in skepticism. "A nocturnal expedition through undocumented wooded territory? Yes, that sounds like a definitive refusal from my perspective," I stated. Ben merely shrugged. "Come on, man. We've engaged in more imprudent activities. I brought along portable illumination devices. It will be enjoyable. We can establish our temporary encampment on the elevated platform, prepare some sustenance, and engage in the complete wilderness camaraderie experience." I hesitated, but only for a fleeting moment. He had a valid contention. We had indeed engaged in more foolish endeavors. Moreover, I harbored no desire to be perceived as the individual who withdrew from an activity that held the promise of being somewhat legendary. Consequently, we assembled our provisions at approximately 8:30 that evening. Ben gathered the fundamental necessities: 2 inexpensive sleeping bags, a miniature portable cooking apparatus, some instant noodle soup, and a battered tent as a precautionary measure. I included 2 handheld illuminators, my ignition device, a container of potable water, and the collapsible bladed implement my paternal uncle had gifted me upon my academic culmination. The mere possession of that knife imparted a marginally greater sense of reassurance as I ventured into the unknown. We departed just prior to 9 o'clock. The sun had largely descended, yet a sliver of residual light persisted in the firmament, sufficient to delineate indistinct forms. The designated path, or what Ben asserted to be a path, initiated directly behind his residential property and immediately submerged itself into a canopy of trees. It was slender, uneven, the sort of rudimentary passage that one only discovers because a limited number of cervine animals have flattened it over the course of many years. Every few paces, I was compelled to evade low-hanging branches or step over partially concealed roots. One such root caused me to stumble so severely that I nearly made contact with the ground face first within the first 5 minutes. "I should have worn shin guards," I mumbled under my breath. Ben merely chuckled and continued his forward progression. "Welcome to nature's fitness establishment," he quipped. After the initial 15 minutes, we engaged in minimal verbal exchange. The forested environment was profoundly disquieting. I had not fully comprehended how accustomed I was to ambient auditory input until I became aware of its complete absence. There were no nocturnal insects, no anurine amphibians, not even the faint buzzing of hematophagous flying insects. Only the rhythmic cadence of our footfalls and the infrequent rustling of foliage as we brushed past vegetation. It felt as though we were submerged beneath a body of water. Every sound was attenuated. Then we traversed past a corroded, antiquated utility vehicle. It was inclined diagonally against an arboreal specimen as though it had been deposited there by a large lifting apparatus. The transparent panels were shattered. Bryophytes grew extensively over the frontal engine compartment. Creeping vines infiltrated the damaged grille. Ben indicated it with a nod. "That has been in that location for an indeterminate period," he stated. "A logging transport, I believe. It lost a wheel. No one ever extracted it." We playfully remarked that it bore a striking resemblance to the quintessential opening scene of virtually every horror film ever produced. The type where the visual perspective focuses intently on an unusual object, and one instinctively knows that an individual is on the precipice of mortality. Approximately half an hour later, we discovered an object suspended from an arboreal branch. Initially, I presumed it to be a mere decorative item similar to those metallic tinkling ornaments some individuals construct. But upon closer inspection, I ascertained that it consisted of skeletal remains. Small ones likely originating from avian creatures or minute rodents. They were conjoined by fragments of deteriorated cordage with several soiled feathers intermingled and smudged red pigment applied to the larger bone fragments. I fixated my gaze upon it, maintaining a respectful distance. "What in the infernal regions is this?" I demanded. Ben narrowed his eyes. "Local inhabitants sometimes leave objects such as this," he elucidated. "They are purportedly protective emblems, some form of indigenous mystical practice. My paternal parent once recounted stories about it, Appalachian sorcery concepts. I found its rotational movement discomforting. There was no discernible air current, yet it slowly revolved as though an imperceptible force was gently impelling it, scrutinizing our presence or indicating a direction. We persisted in our forward progress, and the deeper we ventured, the more profoundly it felt as though we had transgressed into a locale where our presence was forbidden. By the time we discerned the fire observation tower, it was well past the midnight hour. It ascended from the uppermost reaches of the arboreal canopy like a corroded skeletal structure, composed entirely of metallic girders and exhibiting missing sections. The base was encircled by encroaching overgrown vegetation, and the ascending steps were unequivocally not compliant with structural integrity regulations. Some steps were entirely absent, others were distorted like compressed aluminum containers. I directed my gaze towards Ben. "Are you confident this apparatus will bear our combined mass?" I questioned. He responded with a grin. "There is only one method to ascertain that," he stated. We ascended with deliberate slowness and meticulous care, clutching onto the handrails as though we were navigating an intricate climbing frame. A few steps emitted a grinding sound under our weight, and I was compelled to execute a jump over a particular gap that caused a sensation of constriction in my abdominal region. Nevertheless, we ultimately attained the summit. The elevated platform was distorted. Its metallic grating was bent at irregular angles. The diminutive enclosure at the apex, presumably where park wardens once maintained their vigil, remained standing, but it exuded an odor of fungal decay and something even more repugnant. Perhaps a member of the Prochionidae family now resided within it. We did not investigate. Instead, we unrolled our portable sleeping accommodations upon the exposed platform, prepared some instant noodle soup, and contemplated the celestial bodies. For a brief period, it genuinely possessed a somewhat ethereal quality. There was no auditory disturbance, no distractions, merely the two of us and the vast expanse of the sky. Then I perceived it. A faint grinding sound from the ground level below, not the scuttling of a rodent, not the movement of a raccoon. Something ponderous. Ben's illumination device immediately ceased functioning. "Do not move," he whispered with urgency. Both of us froze in place, a step, a pause, another step, another pause. It circumambulated the tower once, then repeated the circuit, slow, deliberate. There was no vocalization, no rustling sound, as though it were searching for something specific, merely those pacing footsteps. I ceased respiration. My cardiac pulsations reverberated loudly within my auditory canals. I mentally enumerated the steps: 12, 13, 14. Then, in profound silence. I am uncertain for how long we maintained that motionless state. It could have been 10 minutes or an entire hour. Eventually, I resumed my respiration. I reassured myself that it was merely a hunter or another recreational walker who had observed our illuminations. At some indeterminate point, I must have drifted into slumber, but upon reawakening, an unsettling sensation permeated my surroundings. Ben's sleeping bag was unoccupied. It was unfastened in the manner he had left it. I adopted an upright posture. "Ben?" I uttered. There was no reply. I arose and stealthily approached the edge of the elevated platform, directing my light downwards. An individual was standing at the foundation. Not Ben. The entity was tall, slender. Its upper limbs were suspended abnormally, excessively elongated, as though they were disoriented as to their intended positioning. Its cranial region was inclined, not in the manner of someone gazing upwards, but as though it were structurally compromised. Its entire corporeal form appeared distorted, elongated. Then I perceived Ben's vocalization. It emanated from within the arboreal expanse. "Josh, I require assistance." The words were too clear, devoid of any discernible emotion, as if someone were replaying an audio recording. Then it reiterated the phrase, the precise words conveyed with the identical intonation. "Josh, I require assistance." I stumbled backwards. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. I had not even consciously realized I had withdrawn my bladed implement. The figure positioned below remained motionless. Then it commenced its ascent, not via the staircase, but by scaling the structural girders, its hands grasping the metallic supports, its limbs articulating in ways that defied anatomical convention. There was no accompanying sound, merely the visual manifestation of movement. I pivoted, my cardiac rhythm accelerating frantically. The ascending pathway behind me was now absent, half collapsed. There was no egress via that route. The entity was midway through its ascent. Then I perceived it again, Josh. But this time I recognized it as Ben, his genuine voice, authentic respiration accompanying the utterance. The entity halted its progression, then descended. It simply released its hold as though its invisible tethering had been severed. I lunged towards the edge. Nothing. It had vanished. Moments later, Ben burst forth from the arboreal expanse below. His countenance was pallid, his handheld illuminator twitching erratically in his grasp. "Go!" he shrieked. "We must depart immediately, the stairs!" I initiated my descent. "Slide down, utilize the beams." I ceased to engage in conscious thought. I seized the nearest supportive pole, swung outwards, and dropped to the ground. I made impact with the earthen surface and slid halfway down the inclining terrain before Ben intercepted me. We did not utter a single word. We simply ran. We barreled through the arboreal growth like wild beasts. Branches tore at our clothing and skin. I am uncertain as to the duration of our flight, perhaps several hours. We succeeded in returning to the cabin around the break of day. Upon reaching the dwelling, Ben forcefully closed the entrance behind us and secured it. Only then did he speak. He stated that he had arisen to relieve himself and had observed something. Initially, he believed it to be me, but its movements were aberrant. Jerky, as though it lacked comprehension of how limbs functioned. Then it moved behind an arboreal specimen and disappeared. Story 3. I was 17 years of age during the summer when my familial circumstances completely deteriorated. My parental figures were in a constant state of contentious discord. The subject matter was inconsequential, whether it pertained to financial matters, domestic chores, the audible volume of the television apparatus, or who had neglected to acquire additional dental hygiene paste. Every minor detail escalated into a full-blown verbal altercation. I would return home from my educational institution and occasionally remain seated in the vehicular ingress, anticipating a cessation of their vociferations, but they never subsided. One particular evening, subsequent to an especially brutal confrontation that culminated in my father propelling a piece of furniture, I communicated with my mother via text message from my sleeping chamber and conveyed my urgent need to escape. She did not even inquire as to my intended destination, merely stating, "Very well, ensure your safety." My paternal uncle Travis possessed a secluded dwelling situated beyond the reach of conventional infrastructure near Franklin, West Virginia. It was not even marked on global positioning system devices, truly in a remote, uninhabited location. I had only visited it once during my childhood. I recalled it as being mundane but profoundly quiet. At that juncture, the prospect of mundanity and tranquility sounded like an idyllic state. Travis was not characterized by warmth or demonstrative affection. He collected me from the bus terminal in complete silence, masticating sunflower seeds and expelling the discarded husks into an antiquated sports drink bottle. Upon our arrival at the cabin, it appeared smaller than my recollection. The external wooden panels had faded to a grayish hue. The screened entryway hung precariously from a single hinge and produced a slapping sound whenever it was caught by the air current. There was a porch swing equipped with only one functioning chain. The interior comprised merely 2 rooms and a sanitary facility. A wood-burning stove occupied a corner, and a compact kitchen area appeared to have remained untouched by cleaning implements since the period of the Clinton administration. The entire dwelling subtly exuded the faint aroma of stale coffee residues and scorched timber. I observed a receptacle for pet food positioned near the basin, but there was no canine present. "Had a mongrel years ago," Travis remarked upon noticing my inquisitive gaze. "Deceased. Bowl simply remains there. Do not pursue the engraved trees, do not remain outdoors after the onset of darkness, and do not venture towards the western direction." I anticipated a humorous punchline or perhaps a logical rationale. I received neither. He turned away, ignited a tobacco cigarette, and that marked the conclusion of the discourse. The ensuing several days were spent by me simply ambulating. I lacked cellular network connectivity, and Travis possessed neither a television nor a radio receiver, so I engaged in exploration. The forested area was exceedingly dense. Hills undulated into additional hills until I was unable to ascertain my original direction of travel. Occasionally, I would halt and merely endeavor to listen, but there were no genuine auditory manifestations. No avian vocalizations, no scuttling rodents, nothing rustling the foliage. It was as though an invisible entity had activated a silencing mechanism, and I began to discern the presence of skeletal fragments. Initially, they were merely small remains. An avian carcass here, a lagomorph carcass there, then a raccoon with its thoracic cage exposed. They were invariably desiccated and thoroughly denuded, as though something had meticulously stripped them clean and arranged them just off the discernible pathway. After a period, I ceased to scrutinize them too closely. However, the incised markings, those truly perturbed me. Random arboreal specimens would bear symbols deeply carved into their cortical layers. Not personal initials or conventional declarations of affection, but rather peculiar formations such as superimposed triangular shapes, delicate spider-like linear patterns, and concentric circular designs. One particular carving depicted what appeared to be two stylized human figures clasping hands, but their cranial regions were represented by X marks. A few of these were encompassed by dark imprints of human hands, equivalent in size to those of a 5-year-old child. And the disconcerting aspect was their apparent movement. For instance, I would perceive one on an arboreal trunk during a daytime excursion, return the following day, and it would have vanished, or alternatively, it would be situated on an entirely different tree. I finally introduced the subject. "What do the symbols signify?" I inquired during a meal of eggs and toasted bread that Travis had deliberately overcooked. He did not lift his gaze, merely muttering, "Do not touch. Do not pursue. Do not inquire again." That constituted the first complete utterance I had heard from him in several days. One particular morning I awoke prior to the rising of the sun. I was simply unable to achieve slumber. I surmised I would venture farther than my usual exploratory range. I placed some dried meat and a portable illuminator into my rucksack and commenced my journey down a narrow pathway I had not previously noticed. It descended between two arboreal specimens that were entirely deceased, as though they had been incinerated from their internal structure outwards. The path curved in an anomalous manner, as if endeavoring to guide me in a circular trajectory, yet never quite completing the circuit. Then it opened into an exposed area. Directly in the center was a circular arrangement of geological formations. Not haphazardly placed rocks, but uniformly spaced, perfectly circular, spanning perhaps 20 feet in diameter. The interior of the circle was utterly barren. There were no leaves, no herbaceous growth, not even entomological specimens, merely compacted earth. And at the epicenter, an arboreal remnant. It was pale in coloration, as though it had just been severed, but it did not correspond to any of the surrounding arboreal specimens. The incision was excessively precise. There was no bark, no irregular edges. It appeared incongruous, as though it did not belong in that location. I advanced a slight distance closer. I did not enter the circle. Then I observed the suspension device. It was dangling from an elevated branch. It was ancient, frayed, and thick, fashioned into a noose. It was not swinging rapidly, merely subtly, as though it had been recently disturbed. I rationalized that the atmospheric currents had caused its movement, but there was no discernible breeze. I pivoted, and an individual was present. He was perhaps 10 feet distant. Devoid of footwear, his integument resembled sun-dried flesh. His upper garment was darkly discolored at the collar and down the thoracic region, and his ribs protruded prominently like a Halloween decorative item. His ocular organs were the most distressing aspect, pale and unblinking, excessively dilated. He was not respiring through his oral cavity, he was inhaling audibly. Inspirations so profound and unhurried that I could perceive them rattling within his chest cavity. His capillary covering hung in unkempt, greasy strands on both sides of his facial structure, and his pedial extremities, they were not resting upon the bryophyte layer. They were embedded within it, as though deeply sunken. His digits were flexed into the subterranean surface. All I managed to articulate was, "Forgive me." I did not raise my voice. I did not immediately flee. I merely offered an apology, as though I had inadvertently entered the incorrect lavatory. He elevated one of his hands and indicated the arboreal remnant. That was when I commenced my frantic escape. I ran with an intensity I had never before experienced in my life. I collided face first into branches. I lacerated my palmar surfaces on sharp stones. At one point, I slid down an inclining surface and landed on my side with such force that I believed I had sustained a rib fracture. My rucksack was torn. My dried meat provisions were lost. My handheld illuminator was somewhere behind me. I did not care. I scrambled to my feet and continued forward. The forested environment felt transformed, more expansive. I was unable to locate anything familiar. The arboreal specimens inclined at peculiar angles as though they had contorted while my attention was diverted. I would perceive avian vocalizations, then a profound silence. The sound of flowing water, then silence. Always just enough auditory input to induce self-doubt regarding my perceptions. When I finally stumbled back into the open area near the cabin, the sun was nearing its descent. My shirt was in tatters, my knees were bleeding, and particulate matter was lodged in my dentition. Travis was awaiting me on the porch, holding his firearm, not aiming it, merely carrying it in his customary manner. "What happened?" he inquired. He observed me for a moment and then stated, "You transgressed into the incorrect enclosure." I replied, "How did you know?" He did not provide an answer. That night we remained silent. He sat on the exterior porch. I occupied the couch within. Around 1 in the morning, I began to perceive the footfalls. Not close by, merely at the periphery of the arboreal expanse. Long, deliberate strides creating a crunching sound from dry foliage, snapping twigs as though they were being intentionally fractured. Then the vocalization emerged. "Mason," it whispered. I adopted an upright posture. It sounded precisely like my mother, the identical tone she employed when unable to locate her keys. "Mason, assist me. I am disoriented." I advanced towards the transparent panel. Travis extended his hand and seized my wrist with considerable force. He shook his head once. He uttered not a single word. "Please," the vocalization implored. "Mason, I require your presence." It was undeniably my mother's voice, but elongated, as though a recording were being replayed through a malfunctioning auditory output device. I commenced to articulate something. Travis clamped his hand over my mouth. We remained seated there throughout the entire nocturnal period. The vocalization circled the cabin, shifting its position as though endeavoring to locate an entry point. At dawn, it ceased. When we examined the ground, there were impressions of bare feet with widely splayed digits. They encircled the cabin, halted directly beneath my transparent panel, then completely vanished. There was no discernible path of egress. I packed my belongings that afternoon. I spoke very little, neither did Travis. He transported me to the bus terminal. Just prior to my disembarkation, he stated, "You were fortunate." Then he drove away. I never disclosed to my parental figures the true nature of the events. I claimed to have experienced homesickness. They did not request specific details. A decade transpired. I relocated twice. I secured a respectable professional position in Richmond. Life established itself into a semblance of normalcy. The cabin, the forested areas, they remained in the recesses of my consciousness like a dream whose reality one questions. Story 4. At the age of 23, I undertook my initial solitary camping excursion within the Blue Ridge region. I had participated in numerous weekend hiking expeditions prior to this, primarily with companions, typically in locations proximate to my abode. These were generally day trips or perhaps an overnight stay accompanied by a fire, some refreshing beverages, and an excessive quantity of confectionery. However, those excursions were always partially about the pathway itself and partially about the social interaction. This particular instance was distinct. I was emerging from a difficult romantic separation, having recently resigned from a professional engagement I detested. And frankly, I felt stagnant. I repeatedly communicated to individuals that I merely required a temporary respite. Yet I believe I was striving to demonstrate to myself my capacity for complete self-reliance. 4 days, devoid of cellular reception, free from distractions, just myself, my equipment, and whatever existed within that environment. The specific location I selected was situated beyond a minuscule settlement named Ledger's Gap. It barely registers on cartographical representations, as though someone had inadvertently transcribed its name incorrectly and no one subsequently rectified the error. I discovered it mentioned on an online forum frequented by hikers. An elderly individual had commented that it was tranquil and consistently uncrowded. That constituted its primary allure. I arrived in my vehicle, which was already prepared and fully laden with provisions. I had configured my portable communication device to an airborne operational mode, informed my sibling of my intended destination, and procured a printed topographical chart from the park ranger station as a precautionary measure. There was no global positioning system navigation, no engagement with social media platforms. I even opted for a light packing strategy. Only the bare essentials: a tent, a water purification device, a few servings of freeze-dried sustenance, my bladed implement, a compact first aid kit, and an unread paperback mystery novel that had been accumulating dust for an entire year. When I halted for fuel just outside Ledger's Gap, I inquired of the counter attendant whether the Firebrush Trail remained accessible. He did not even elevate his gaze from the counter, merely nodded once and muttered, "Yes, always open." There was no welcoming smile, no cautionary advice, not even an admonition to exercise care. The general atmosphere was peculiar, but I attributed it to the characteristic awkwardness of a small town. I remunerated him for a bottle of potable water and continued my journey. The commencement of the trail was fundamentally a patch of unpaved surface situated off a curvature in the thoroughfare. There was a dilapidated wooden post supporting a sun-bleached sign that declared, "No maintenance beyond this point." There was no designated parking area, no ranger information booth, no other parked vehicles. It appeared to be the sort of locale that people simply forget exists. I secured my vehicle, tightened the straps of my rucksack, and stepped onto the path. The initial few miles were aesthetically pleasing. The path meandered between towering arboreal specimens with bryophyte-covered trunks and low-lying shrubs that produced a rustling sound when I brushed against them. The ambient air carried the scent of earth and aged foliage. Occasionally, I would perceive the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker or observe a scuttling rodent darting through the undergrowth, but otherwise a profound silence prevailed. It was tranquil, yet simultaneously somewhat uncanny. By the late afternoon, I had traversed approximately 6 miles and located a section of level ground adjacent to a minor watercourse. It was not an officially designated camping area, but it was ideal. The soil was soft, devoid of geological formations, providing a clear space for my tent and a slight incline nearby where I could repose and consume my meal. I erected the tent, purified some water from the watercourse, heated a packet of chili over my miniature cooking apparatus, and then reclined on a log with my footwear removed, observing the current of the stream. That inaugural night passed entirely without incident. I remained awake, engrossed in reading by the illumination of my headlamp, then entered my sleeping bag and succumbed to slumber amidst the gentle sound of flowing water and the soft rustling of leaves above my tent. On the subsequent morning, I resolved to undertake a light hike. A rocky vantage point was indicated on the topographical chart, approximately 2 miles further along the ridge. I left my tent and primary gear in place, bringing only a compact day pack containing provisions, potable water, and my map. As a measure of precaution, I tore an antiquated crimson garment into strips and affixed one to a branch every 100 yards or so to delineate my path. Nothing elaborate, merely swift, simple knots to prevent myself from becoming disoriented. The ascent was unremarkable, and I encountered not a single individual. The path narrowed and became progressively steeper as I approached the overlook, but eventually I located the geological prominence described on the map. The vista was quite magnificent. Layers of verdant foliage stretched in every direction, the uppermost sections of the arboreal canopy merging into a monolithic barrier. I seated myself upon a large rock, withdrew some granola and dried meat, and listened intently. There were no vehicular sounds, no human voices, no overhead aircraft. Merely the sound of the air current, the rustling of leaves, and my own mastication. I remained there for perhaps half an hour before commencing my return. It was approximately 2 p.m. when I arrived back at my temporary camp, and that was when I observed it. Approximately 20 feet from my tent, affixed to a branch, at shoulder height, was a strip of crimson fabric. It possessed the identical coloration and fabric composition, but it was definitively not one of mine. I approached it and immediately noticed that the fastening was distinct, more taut, and appeared to be more deliberately executed. My own fastenings were merely swift, uncomplicated loops. This one bore the appearance of having been performed by someone practiced. The strip was also darker in hue, as though it had been exposed to moisture or perhaps dragged through particulate matter. I remained standing there for an extended minute, simply fixating upon it, endeavoring to persuade myself that I might have tied it and subsequently forgotten, but that explanation lacked coherence. I had not been in this particular section of the camp during my earlier hike. I had affixed the last marker considerably further up the ridge. I re-examined all my original markers, retracing the initial segment of the path back towards the overlook. All of mine were still present. This new one did not conform to the established pattern. It had not been present that morning. I did not consume an evening meal that night. I enclosed myself within the tent as soon as the solar orb dipped below the horizon, my bladed implement within immediate reach, and merely reclined there, listening. Every rustling sound from outside seemed to possess an amplified volume. Every shift in the air current caused me to recoil, but nothing manifested. Nothing made contact with the tent. I achieved very little sleep. By morning, I had arrived at a resolution. The park ranger's topographical chart indicated the presence of a rudimentary shelter cabin approximately 8 miles deeper into the arboreal expanse. I reasoned that if someone intended to harass me, they would not anticipate my venturing further inward. The cabin possessed 4 walls, potentially even a locking mechanism, and conceivably an antiquated ranger radio communication device. I packed only what was essential and commenced my journey early. Approximately 2 hours into my trek, the forested environment began to feel different. Not precisely menacing, just profoundly still, as though all auditory input had been muted. The avian vocalization ceased. Even my own footfalls seemed to possess a diminished volume. It was then that I perceived it. Movement ahead. Swift, light steps. Too faint for a cervine animal. Too fluid to be a member of the Procyonidae family. I halted, vocalized, "Hello," but received no response. The path diverged approximately 50 yards ahead. The left branch ascended sharply up a ridge. The right branch descended into a more densely vegetated section of the valley. I stood there, attempting to determine which direction the map intended me to proceed. Then I observed it. On a branch just up the left pathway was another strip of crimson fabric. The identical knot as the one near my tent. The identical placement. I did not hesitate. I turned to the right and continued my forward progression. I did not halt again. I did not consult the map. I simply desired the security of enclosed walls around me. The shelter was barely structurally sound. A single-room wooden edifice with a dented metallic roof, and a distorted door that emitted a piercing shriek when I opened it. The interior exuded the aroma of burning wood and rodent droppings. There was an antiquated shelf supporting a corroded container of preserved legumes, a fractured sweeping implement, and a collection of foliage in the corner. But it possessed a locking bolt on the entrance and a robust wall to lean against. I enclosed myself within, ignited a candle, and seated myself with my back against the wall, bladed implement in hand. I did not engage in reading. I did not consume sustenance. I merely listened intently. Sometime after the midnight hour, I perceived it. 2 deliberate percussive sounds upon the external wall. Not the wind, not falling branches, the sound of knuckles. I suspended my respiration. A few minutes later, the entrance creaked ever so slightly, just enough to discern the strain of the timber as though someone had exerted their weight against it, then released. That was the extent of it. I waited for several hours. Nothing further transpired. When the celestial expanse began to brighten, I hastily deposited all my belongings into my rucksack and bolted. I did not pause to properly secure my footwear. I did not consume sustenance. I ran nearly 10 miles continuously, barely observing the pathway. When I reached the trailhead, my vehicle remained in its original position. I leaned against it, panting for breath, staring back at the arboreal growth as though something might pursue me out. As I maneuvered my vehicle onto the thoroughfare, I passed the antiquated Ledger's Gap welcome sign affixed to the post, which I had barely noticed upon my initial arrival. Story 5. By the month of October, I found myself in the western region of North Carolina, characterized by undulating green landforms and arboreal expanses extending as far as my perception allowed. I commenced my explorations within officially designated state recreational areas, but once the atmospheric temperature decreased and the weekend aggregations of individuals diminished, I began to deviate from the conventionally trodden pathways. Fewer individuals translated into a greater sense of unrestricted freedom. One hazy afternoon, I halted at a solitary fuel station, merely a singular pump situated by a curvature in the highway, seeking guidance regarding obscure trails. The counter attendant, an individual with a congenial facial expression, informed me of an antiquated location situated just off the scenic Blue Ridge Parkway. He conveyed his message in a manner that suggested both prudence and the presence of an unspoiled rural gem. That information proved sufficient for my purposes. I maneuvered my vehicle into the commencement of the trail late on a Friday. It consisted of a gravel surface, a sagging informational placard of sufficient size to imply the availability of maps, and only one other conveyance, a red compact SUV with a fractured rear light assembly and a faded Rescue Canines Do Not Shop adhesive emblem affixed to the bumper. Particulate matter coated the frontal engine compartment. It appeared to be abandoned. I shrugged, parked nearby, and commenced loading my rucksack. The ascending pathway was steep for the initial mile or so, just enough to reacquaint me with the sensation of gravitational pull. Then it transitioned into meandering switchbacks, deeply embedded amidst hickory and oak arboreal specimens. The undergrowth was interwoven like deteriorated cordage. With each subsequent footfall, the auditory landscape grew more subdued, as though a silencing mechanism had been activated upon life itself. Avian vocalization softened, the air current assumed a respectful quiescence, and even the olfactory sensations of the forest became subtle. There were no vehicular sounds, no aerial craft, merely arboreal specimens and their associated quiet. I hiked until I located a level area adjacent to a trickling watercourse, an ideal spot for establishing camp. The ambient air felt invigoratingly cool upon my facial structure, but not frigid. I prepared instant noodle soup on my diminutive cooking apparatus, contemplated the celestial bodies that seemed closer than customary, and experienced that profound, gentle stillness of the woods enveloping me. Then came the midnight hour. I abruptly assumed an upright posture. There was no rustling, no individual vociferating my appellation, merely an instantaneous jolt that propelled me into a state of heightened awareness. The fabric walls of my tent remained motionless. I barely dared to effect any movement. Then I perceived it. Tentative footfalls, not characteristic of small creatures, but sufficiently heavy to suggest a human presence, creating a crackling sound from fallen leaves approximately 20 feet distant. One deliberate step following another, then a pause, another crackle, another pause. Silence. Perhaps 5 minutes later, I cautiously unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside. Nothing stirred. I could have sworn a shadowy form flickered, but perhaps it was an illusion created by the lunar illumination. I detected no wild animal odors. There was no growling or scuffing sound, merely a slow, deliberate perambulation around my chosen site. I resecured my tent and rationalized that it was either a raccoon or perhaps an exceptionally cautious ursine creature. I have heard the ponderous movements of large bears. They emit guttural sounds. They inhale audibly. This felt excessively light-footed, too human-like. Morning arrived, accompanied by cool air permeating the tent. I executed my movements swiftly, consolidating my belongings with one hand while the other held my caffeinated beverage, half-cooked noodles sloshing within the cooking vessel. I did not await its cooling. I simply thrust the entire contents into my rucksack and proceeded deeper into the arboreal expanse. My aim was to find a more tranquil and remote location from any other human presence. It was later that I discovered a bryophyte-covered clearing containing a forgotten circular arrangement for a fire. The stones so thoroughly blackened that they resembled ancient artifacts enveloped by verdant growth. A sense of relief washed over me. I adopted a seated posture, consumed dried meat from the crinkling packaging on my lap, and meticulously inscribed my observations in my personal record, noting the peculiar silence of this remote area. Simple reflections, as though I were communicating with an intimate acquaintance who would comprehend. Then the solar orb began its descent. I advanced 20 feet from the clearing solely to gather desiccated branches for a fire. That was when I became utterly immobilized. Between the arboreal specimens, an individual was standing there. There were no footfalls, no audible signal of displaced vegetation. They were simply present, upright, observing. Sufficiently tall to be an adult male. I ceased respiration. My oral cavity became dry. I initially believed they might be disoriented, perhaps seeking a camping location, but I vocalized, "Hey," and received no response. They barely shifted their position when I took a step backward. Just a minuscule adjustment, like a redistribution of weight. No gesture of acknowledgement, nothing at all, merely a motionless human form. So I pivoted, my cardiac organ reverberating, and returned directly, not with haste, but with deliberate intent. I consolidated my belongings at that camp using the illumination of a handheld device, my bladed implement clutched in my hand, my headlamp positioned by my sleeping cushion. I do not believe I achieved more than a few fragmented minutes of slumber. Every sound of a snapping twig or a gust of wind rustling leaves caused me to spring into an upright posture. By dawn, I had crammed everything into my rucksack. There was no leisure for a hot beverage or for resting, and I retraced my steps with rapidity. The pathway now felt anomalous. Shadows appeared distorted. Rocks I distinctly remembered seemed to be absent. I repeatedly checked over my shoulder. 2 miles from the designated parking area, I halted. The compact SUV was present, but not in the location where I had left it. It was situated off the path, stationary, nestled between two arboreal trunks as though someone had driven it in and subsequently abandoned it. The frontal engine compartment was coated with pine needles, more particulate matter than when I had departed. A window was partially opened. I circumnavigated the entire vehicle. There were no foot impressions indicating entry or exit from the wooded area. No associated camping site. The interior was devoid of contents. There was no cooking apparatus, no sleeping pads, no equipment. Merely a gray air freshener suspended low and a dark, dried blemish upon the fabric of the rear seating area. My thoracic region constricted. I pivoted abruptly and hastened down the path, breathing heavily, propelling my upper limbs. I did not cease until I reached the parking lot. My transport vehicle was precisely where I had left it. Its access points were secured with no peculiar anomalies in its vicinity. Yet that oppressive sensation had not dissipated. I revved the engine and drove away without even contemplating my destination. A couple of hours later, I found myself in an inexpensive roadside accommodation. Its interior featured wood paneling, dusty seating arrangements, and singular light bulbs suspended low. I seated myself and merely fixated upon the caffeinated beverage they presented to me. My hands caused the drinking vessel to tremble so violently that it clanked against its resting plate. The server inscribed notes on a pad with a writing implement that emitted a squeaking sound. She inquired as to my well-being. I gurgled out, "I require transportation," and uttered no further words. Not concerning the teeth, not concerning the cabin, not concerning that particular canine. That evening I meticulously cleansed everything. My footwear, my rucksack, my garments, until the washing and drying machines sounded as though they were on the verge of explosive disintegration. I meticulously resecured every locking mechanism, left illumination devices activated throughout the entire nocturnal period. I kept the window coverings drawn. I was unable to achieve slumber. I drifted in and out of consciousness, observing my primary entrance, awaiting verification that my judgment had been erroneous, waiting for an individual or an entity to materialize through the obscurity. 2 days later, an instant photograph arrived in my postal receptacle. The identical image of the stream bed, but a closer perspective, filled with my likeness, my facial features, my shirt, my bag, as though they had been specifically targeted. It was not accidental background noise or a random point-and-shoot capture. It was deliberate and carefully composed. I did not open it. I merely fixated upon it. That constituted the ultimate threshold. I packed a container that evening. 2 weeks subsequently, I disposed of my property in Bell Ridge Hollow and relocated. Currently, I only traverse officially marked pathways and recreational areas populated with other individuals. If I encounter a stacked stone formation that is not indicated on a trail sign, I promptly depart. Story 6. I inadvertently discovered an unusual post on an antiquated online hiking discussion board. It was deeply embedded within a conversational thread concerning disused trails. The text lacked capitalization and was presented as an extended, disorganized diatribe concerning a network of subterranean passages situated somewhere near the border between the states of Tennessee and North Carolina. It did not furnish geographical coordinates or any other practical information. Merely a few indistinct photographic images of a corroded wire mesh barrier partially concealed by creeping vines on a ridge located behind what the poster asserted was a former park ranger facility. However, it was the concluding sentence that became indelibly etched in my consciousness. It stated, "Reverse your direction if you perceive clicking sounds. Do not persist in your advancement. I am entirely serious." That particular sentence permeated my cognitive processes and remained persistently there. Initially, I saved the post simply because of its idiosyncratic nature. Yet, over the course of the subsequent few weeks, I found myself repeatedly returning to it, pondering whether just possibly it possessed an element of veracity. By the time the month of June arrived, I had a week of professional leave and no pre-existing engagements. Curiosity had thoroughly seized my faculties. Consequently, I packed my equipment, a headlamp, a supplementary handheld illuminator, a bladed implement, a spool of string, provisions, a compact sleeping shelter, and undertook the 6-hour vehicular journey into the mountainous terrain. I established my temporary encampment near a fire access road, sufficiently off the main grid that my portable communication device became functionally inert. There was no signal, no digital maps, merely myself amidst the arboreal growth. The following morning, I followed the directives as precisely as possible, utilizing the landmarks referenced in the post. First appeared the twin birch trees that bifurcated at their base like a bifurcated bone, then a division in the watercourse. I selected the left path, finally an extended curvature in the inclining terrain shaped like a horseshoe which guided me directly to it. The park ranger facility appeared half engulfed by the forested environment. Its roof had collapsed, its entrance hung precariously by a single splinter, and its transparent panels were shattered. A wooden sign leaned against the wall bearing the inscription, "Crow Hill Ranger Outpost." I had not observed it on any of the maps I had consulted prior to my expedition. Behind the structure, beyond some moss-covered boulders, I located the barrier. It appeared exactly as depicted in the photographic image. It was antiquated, entangled in vines, and bent outwards at the base where something or someone had managed to pass through. So, I emulated their action. I proceeded along what barely qualified as a pathway. So, was not truly discernible unless one was actively seeking it. Merely a shallow depression through the undergrowth. The ascent consumed approximately 40 minutes. There were no avian vocalizations, no entomological specimens. The sole auditory input was the crunching of foliage beneath my specialized footwear and my own respiratory sounds. It felt as though the forest had activated a silencing mechanism. Eventually, the ridge narrowed and I discerned it. A fissure in the geological formation on the northward-facing incline. It did not appear significant, merely a jagged slit within the calcareous rock. I turned sideways and squeezed through the aperture, my rucksack snagging on the edges. Inside, the temperature rapidly plummeted. The ambient air was humid and stagnant, sufficiently dense that I could almost perceive the taste of minerals. I activated my head-mounted illuminator and secured one end of my spool of string to a rock near the entrance. This was a standard maneuver for cave exploration. The passage twisted downwards and deeper, and after a few turns, daylight completely vanished. After approximately 20 minutes of careful perambulation, I entered a more expansive subterranean chamber. My illumination device projected its beam upon the walls, and I halted. There were carvings present everywhere. Spirals, stylized human figures, deep indentations. Some of them resembled human beings, but in an aberrant manner. Their upper limbs were excessively elongated, their cranial regions absent or shaped like circular forms. One particular figure had its hands elevated towards another, smaller one. It did not appear to be artistic expression. It appeared as though someone was endeavoring to document an event. I retrieved my portable communication device to capture a photographic image, elevated it, and my headlamp flickered erratically. I tapped the side. The illumination stabilized. I turned to depart. Then I perceived it. Just one sharp percussive sound echoing faintly behind me. Click, click, click. It was not the sound of water. It was not random. There was a discernible rhythm to it, almost as though it possessed significance. I became rigid for perhaps 3 seconds, then slowly began to retreat towards the entrance, the string still clutched in my hand. I directed my handheld illuminator towards the passage behind me, and then the string was abruptly pulled with considerable force, as though someone had yanked it from the opposite end. I immediately released my grip. The clicking ceased. I waited, breathing heavily, straining to perceive any sound whatsoever. For a fleeting moment, there was complete silence. Then I caught a fleeting glimpse of movement. Low to the ground, rapid, just a momentary perception. Pale integument, elongated digits disappearing around a curvature. That proved sufficient. I turned and fled, devoid of conscious thought, solely driven by primal instinct. My illumination device swung wildly, its beam ricocheting off the subterranean walls. Every inclining surface felt steeper, every curvature felt tighter. I slipped, landed heavily on my side, and slid down a rocky incline. My handheld illuminator flew from my grasp and skittered away. I crawled towards it and reactivated its illumination. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. I was in a smaller chamber with no discernible exit. Then the clicking recommenced, closer this time. I assumed an upright posture and pressed myself against the wall, listening to the echoes reverberating through the passage. Click, click, and then it entered, moving on all fours. Its limbs were articulated in ways that defied comprehension, as though its joints were oriented in the incorrect direction. Its integument was pallid and stretched thinly over its skeletal structure. There were no ocular organs, no nasal features, no facial structure whatsoever. Merely smooth skin with a slender slit where a mouth might have been. It held two diminutive black geological formations in its hands. Click, click, click. Then it ceased its movement, inclined its cranial region, released the stones, and emitted a scream. Not through its mouth. The auditory manifestation emanated from every direction, as if the subterranean environment itself were screaming, a horrific metallic shriek that reverberated through my skeletal framework. My handheld illuminator ceased to function. I did not linger to contemplate. I dropped it and fled. My upper limbs outstretched, colliding with geological formations, clawing my way through constricted apertures, scrambling up inclining surfaces. My palmar surfaces became lacerated, my knees bruised. I did not care. I simply persisted in my movement. After what felt like an eternity, I perceived a faint sliver of daylight ahead. I forcibly propelled myself through a narrow fissure in the rock and collapsed onto the ridge. I did not cease running until I reached the fire access road, collapsed next to my vehicle, and remained there for what must have been an hour, merely listening, waiting. Eventually, I drove home. However, when I attempted to locate that post again, it had vanished, deleted. There was no trace of its existence. The ranger station is not listed in any official documentation. Story 7. Last October, I consented to undertake the responsibility of caring for my kinsperson Jason's residence while he and his significant other embarked upon a 2-week hiking expedition in Colorado. They had been meticulous in their planning for several months, and when their initially designated house sitter withdrew, he inquired if I could provide assistance. He suggested I could benefit from a change of environment. At that particular time, I was 27 years of age, unemployed, and residing once again in my parental figure's subterranean living area, certainly not experiencing a flourishing period. Consequently, the concept of spending a fortnight in a tranquil cabin, devoid of obligations, accompanied solely by his canine companions, sounded like a period of respite I desperately required. Jason and Kayla resided extensively within the Blue Ridge segment of the Appalachian Mountains near a municipality named Clarksville. It is one of those geographical locations that does not appear on conventional maps unless one already possesses knowledge of its existence. Their rustic dwelling was situated approximately 20 minutes outside the town, nestled back behind a series of winding roadways, a single unpaved path, and what felt like an innumerable quantity of arboreal specimens. It was the kind of place that effectively disappears from any digital map once your cellular signal diminishes, which it did approximately halfway there. Upon my arrival, Jason was already awaiting me outside with Sophie and Tank, his two canine companions. Sophie was an indolent, elderly golden retriever who appeared to have experienced more favorable years. Tank, conversely, was younger, a crossbreed of a Siberian husky with an excessive abundance of kinetic energy and a gaze that instilled the sensation of being critically evaluated in every action one performed. Jason provided me with a written document containing all pertinent information: access codes for entry, the password for the wireless internet connection, and several contingency directives. Just prior to his departure, he indicated towards the side of the cabin and stated, "Should the electrical power cease functioning, which it occasionally does, the circuit breaker panel is located in the subterranean area. You will need to access it via the storm doors situated at the rear." "Wait," I interjected. "I believe this structure was erected upon a flat foundation." He directed a peculiar gaze at me as though I had just inquired whether the sky possessed a cerulean hue. "No, it is excavated into the ground, but do not linger in that lower area. The structural foundation is aged and it tends to be damp. Simply reset the circuit and reascend." Then, as he was proceeding towards his vehicle, he pivoted and stated, "Oh, and if you undertake any perambulations, remain upon the designated path. Do not venture into the arboreal expanse. Some local inhabitants here do not favor individuals who trespass." I assumed he was referring to hunters or private property boundaries or similar restrictions. The initial few days were, in actuality, quite agreeable, tranquil. I awoke late, provided sustenance to the canine companions, prepared pasta, and engaged in reading literary works I had not accessed in years. The cabin was comfortable, slightly redolent of aged dampness, but not in an unpleasant manner. More as though it possessed unshared narratives. There were expansive, transparent panels facing the arboreal expanse, and during the daylight hours, the solar illumination penetrated through the arboreal specimens and painted the interior walls with slow-moving linear patterns. There was no ambient auditory input outdoors, however. No avian vocalizations, no nocturnal insects, merely the sound of the air current and nearby watercourses emanating from the dwelling. During the nocturnal period, the silence manifested differently. It was not merely quiet, but a total absence of sound. I would occasionally seat myself there and snap my digits simply to create an auditory sensation. Even the canine companions did not emit any barking sounds. They would recline there, their auditory appendages twitching as though they were perceiving something that remained beyond my audibility. On the fourth evening, I was midway through an antiquated cinematic production when the electrical illumination ceased. There was no flickering, merely a singular soft click, as though someone had activated a switch in another chamber. Everything plunged into darkness. I waited for perhaps a minute, anticipating its restoration. Nothing. So I retrieved the handheld illuminator from the culinary area, donned my footwear, and proceeded out the rear entrance. The storm doors were heavier than their appearance suggested, constructed of metal with robust hinges that emitted a groaning sound when I pulled them open. The stone steps descending were slick with bryophyte and fallen foliage. I held the handheld illuminator low and cautiously observed my footing. Approximately halfway down, something produced a crunching sound beneath my footwear. I paused and directed the beam downwards. A minuscule, desiccated bone fragment. I knelt and pushed aside some foliage and discovered additional fragments. Small vertebral segments, ribs, perhaps a mandibular bone, meticulously stripped clean. The circuit breaker box appeared to be in proper condition. I deactivated the main switch, then reactivated it. Nothing transpired. I remained standing there for a second, attempting to ascertain whether I had executed the procedure incorrectly, when the canine companions erupted into vociferous barking. Not merely noise, they were in a state of full defensive readiness, Tank in particular. His barks reverberated through the cabin as though he were prepared to violently tear something apart. I bolted up the steps, nearly losing my footing at the apex, and hastened back inside. Both canine companions were positioned at the sliding glass transparent panel. Pressed against it, their fur bristled, their dentition exposed. Tank emitted a low, rumbling growl. Sophie remained immobile beside him, her auditory appendages flattened against her cranial structure. I directed the beam of the handheld illuminator through the transparent panel and became rigid. There were 2 hand imprints, not merely smudges, but actual hand imprints. Perfectly greasy outlines pressed against the external surface of the door. Positioned low to the ground, of a size consistent with a child, lacking opposable digits, merely 4 elongated digits on each hand. I recoiled, my abdominal region constricted, my cardiac organ reverberating in my auditory canals. Tank growled again, more deeply this time, as though he desired to leap through the entrance. I cracked it open by merely an inch and vocalized, "Hey, who is out there?" Nothing, just arboreal specimens and darkness. I stepped onto the porch and swept the beam of the handheld illuminator to the left, then to the right. It flickered. I struck it against my palm and it stabilized. Still nothing. I returned inside and secured the entrance. That night I did not achieve slumber. I dragged a seating apparatus into the hallway, positioned myself facing the rear entrance, and clutched a culinary bladed implement in my lap, merely awaiting. By morning, the hand imprints had vanished, and I do not mean they had merely faded. They were gone. The transparent panel was impeccably clean, as though someone had passed through with a microfiber cloth and meticulously removed them. I contacted Jason and recounted every detail. There was a pause. Then he stated, "Occasionally, local inhabitants interfere with individuals. It is insignificant. If they harbored malicious intent, they would have acted already." He articulated it with an overly flat tone, as though he were reciting a prearranged statement. That night, I maintained the absence of electrical illumination. Just myself, the handheld illuminator, and a container of hot infused beverage. Around 11:30 p.m., I perceived tapping sounds, light, random percussive impacts on the roofing structure, not akin to precipitation, but more like small stones being cast from various angles. I stepped outside and directed the illumination upwards. I caught a glimpse of something moving. Just for a second, something small and swift retracted over the edge of the roof. "Hello," I vocalized. Then I perceived it emitting a whisper, high-pitched like a child testing the articulation of my Appalachian for the very first time, drawn out and soft as though it lacked comprehension of the word's meaning. I retreated into the dwelling and forcefully closed the entrance, securing it, then resumed my seated position in the hallway. The canine companions did not emit any barking sounds this time. They merely whined. The subsequent morning, I ascended to inspect the roof. More hand, imprints the identical dimensions. 4 digits, no opposable thumbs. That conclusively decided my course of action. I consolidated all my belongings. I deposited canine provisions, seized a bag, and loaded the canine companions into Jason's utility vehicle. I was returning to the culinary area to retrieve my charging device when Tank emitted a growl. He stood rigidly in front of the food storage cabinet, bearing his dentition. Sophie crawled beneath the table and refused to emerge. I tapped the wall behind the food storage cabinet. It was hollow. I crouched down and discerned something I had not previously noticed. a small access panel for a crawl space beneath the lowest shelf. I moved the shelf aside and opened it. The handheld illuminator barely reached the farthest extremity, but what I could perceive caused my integument to feel as though something were crawling upon it, hundreds of scratches. Thin, shallow indentations incised into the floorboards as though minuscule digits had been dragged across them repeatedly. The timber appeared to have been gnawed upon. I closed it and telephoned Jason. "I am departing," I stated. "Something is amiss here." He did not dispute my decision, merely inquired, "Can you inspect the far corner of the crawl space before you depart? I left some capture devices there last winter." "No," I informed him. "I am not opening that thing again." He did not press the issue. I did not return home that night. I drove directly to a roadside accommodation off the highway, 20 miles distant. I slept with the canine companions on the sleeping surface and a seating apparatus wedged beneath the entrance knob. Story 8. My name is Jamie, and I was 24 years of age when I undertook my inaugural solitary hiking expedition through the Blue Hollow Range, situated proximate to the border between the states of Tennessee and Georgia. It was not a dramatically significant decision or an element of a personal spiritual quest or whatever other typical rationalizations individuals often offer. I was not pursuing inner tranquility or fleeing from personal tribulations. I had simply recently been terminated from a professional role I did not even find enjoyable, a mundane clerical occupation where the zenith of my daily experience involved observing the automatic beverage dispenser become obstructed, and I harbored no desire to provide explanations or feign contentment. Consequently, I packed a bag and departed from the urban area. I brought with me sufficient provisions for a few days, a tent, one of those disposable cellular communication devices procurable at retail fuel establishments, a rudimentary global positioning system unit that appeared more suited for a second-hand merchandise outlet, and an antiquated paper map featuring faded trails. I had printed it from an online hiking forum. There was no cellular network coverage in that area, which honestly felt like an advantage at the time. The initial night unfolded without incident. Indeed, it was quite peaceful. I established my temporary camp near a watercourse with just enough space to suspend my woven sleeping net between two arboreal specimens. I prepared some unappetizing instant noodle soup on my miniature cooking apparatus and listened to Anuran amphibians emitting peculiar clicking sounds while I fixated upon the flowing water. There were a few distant fracturing sounds emanating from the arboreal expanse. Snapping twigs, something shifting within the undergrowth, but such sounds are commonplace in that environment. It did not cause me disquiet. In fact, it felt like the first occasion I had experienced a form of silence that was not characterized by emptiness. The subsequent morning, I recommenced my hiking activity, and approximately 6 miles into my trek, I observed an antiquated, partially concealed pathway veering off to the left. It was largely obscured by dense undergrowth, but remained traversable. I am uncertain what prompted me to deviate, perhaps boredom or curiosity. It felt like one of those decisions one makes without excessive deliberation, akin to choosing a circuitous route home for no apparent reason. The pathway curled downwards into a more densely vegetated section of the forest where the arboreal specimens were closely packed and illumination barely penetrated. There were no additional trail markers, and the ambient air felt profoundly still, as though nothing had traversed through it for an extended period. Then I observed it. A collapsed structural entity just off to the side, shaped like a cabin but barely maintaining its integrity. It appeared to have been in that location for several decades. One entire side had subsided into the ground, and the roof had collapsed inwards like a crushed container, perhaps 10 by 10 feet at most. There were no conventional entrance points, merely an aperture where one likely once existed. and the transparent panels were vacant, possessing only jagged edges where the frames had undergone decay. Inside was an ancient corroded stove tipped onto its side, and lying adjacent to it, partially buried in soil, was an instant photograph. I cleansed it and scrutinized it more closely. It was a photographic image of a male individual devoid of an upper garment standing in front of that precise cabin. The identical angle, the identical distorted frame visible in the background. The photograph was faded, particularly at its peripheries, but his facial features, situated precisely in the center, were sharp. His ocular organs did not appear to focus on anything specific. There was no discernible expression, merely a blank stare, as though he was unaware the image was being captured. I inverted it. There was no date, no appellation, just blank space. I experienced a sensation of unease. Not terror or anything of that magnitude, just a feeling of being unsettled, as though I had inadvertently stumbled upon something private. I did not step inside, merely captured a photographic image of the cabin with my portable communication device. Placed the instant photograph in my pocket and continued my perambulation. Around 4 p.m., I located a suitable temporary encampment uphill from the cabin, perhaps 50 or 60 yards distant. I selected it specifically because the arboreal specimens obstructed the view of my point of origin. I recall thinking, if I cannot perceive it, it cannot perceive me. That night I experienced difficulty in achieving slumber. Not due to auditory disturbances, there were none, but because of the profound quietude. There were no nocturnal insects, no air currents, merely that deep forest silence that instills the sensation of being the sole surviving individual on the planet. Sometime after 2 a.m., I awoke abruptly, simply jolted awake as though I had perceived something but was unable to recall what it was. I reclined there in the woven sleeping net, completely immobile, and that was when I noticed it was in motion, not swaying gently from a breeze. It felt as though someone had traversed past and propelled it once, just enough to cause it to swing slightly and then cease. I did not move, merely extended my arm and seized my handheld illuminator, slowly activating its illumination. Nothing. No movement. No auditory input. Then after perhaps 30 seconds, I perceived it. Branches fracturing somewhere downhill, not close but not far either. Another fracture, then silence again. I assumed an upright posture and whispered, "Hello?" No response. Then I perceived it. A short cough, dry like someone attempting to clear their pharynx but endeavoring not to attract attention. It emanated from the direction of the cabin. I remained rigid until the celestial expanse began to lighten. I did not achieve another second of slumber. When I finally arose, I meticulously scanned the area, and that was when I observed it. A foot impression in the soil, approximately 4 feet from where I had slept. It was a bare foot, large with widely splayed digits. There was no indication of footwear or tread, just one clean impression, as though whoever it was had remained standing there for a duration before departing. I did not even consume sustenance. I packed my belongings in silence and commenced following the map back towards the planned trail loop. After a couple of miles, I noticed that the forest felt peculiar. There were no avian vocalizations, no buzzing insects, not even a breeze among the arboreal specimens, just myself and my footfalls. It was then that I began to perceive the incised markings. Initially, they were merely linear incisions, deep vertical slashes in the cortical layers. But then the patterns became more specific, a spiral contained within a quadrilateral, a cross that bent at peculiar angles, almost like symbolic representations. I passed perhaps 7 or 8 arboreal specimens bearing different incised markings. They appeared too deliberate to be casual vandalism, too ancient to be part of some recent recreational walker's prank. Then I observed the facial image carved into the trunk of a large oak tree. It featured elongated oval ocular organs, a stretched oral aperture oriented downwards. It was not crudely executed. It possessed sufficient detail to appear as though someone had invested considerable time in its creation. That made the situation more disturbing. I retrieved my portable communication device to capture a photographic image. That was when I observed him behind the next arboreal specimen, simply standing there as immobile as a sculpture, shirtless, his integument pallid like a waxy substance. He was partially concealed by the trunk, but I could discern his facial features. He did not blink, did not flinch, merely fixated his gaze directly upon me as though he had been awaiting my presence. I do not recall turning around. I only know that I ran at maximum velocity. I had no comprehension of my destination. Pure panic consumed me. I ducked behind a massive fallen log, crouched down and waited. There were no auditory inputs, no sounds of running footsteps, just profound quietude. After perhaps 15 minutes, I recommenced my movement, but I did not return towards the trail. I began cutting west, utilizing my navigational compass, hoping to locate a thoroughfare or anything of human construction. Around midday, I discovered a clearing and another cabin. This one was distinct. It appeared newer, its roof solid. A slender plume of smoke was ascending from something situated behind it. Animal pelts were suspended from a line in front of the dwelling, and implements were scattered across a wooden surface. I am uncertain why I approached closer, but I did. I moved with extreme slowness, maintaining my position within the arboreal cover. Then I perceived the aroma. Burnt flesh, thick, greasy, clinging to the posterior region of my pharynx. There was a metallic container near the porch, and smoke was emanating from beneath its lid. I stealthily approached and peered inside. Skeletal remains, large, unusually shaped, not those of cervine creatures or ursine animals. Something about their structural configuration caused my abdominal region to twist. I recoiled rapidly and nearly tripped over an arboreal root. That was when I perceived the cabin door emitting a creaking sound as it opened. I did not wait to ascertain the identity of the individual who emerged. I ran with such intensity that I was unable to perceive my pedial extremities. I traversed a dry watercourse bed, clawed my way up an inclining surface utilizing arboreal roots and geological formations, and did not cease until I reached the summit of the ridge and observed nothing behind me. Still silent, still anomalous, I continued walking until nightfall descended once again. It was then that I discerned the elevated hunting platform affixed to an arboreal specimen. It was positioned high, perhaps 30 feet aloft, but I did not care. I ascended it with greater rapidity than I believed myself capable of. The platform was barely of sufficient size to accommodate a seated individual, but I huddled there, wrapped my outer garment around me, and waited. Around the midnight hour, I perceived it. Footsteps, slow, one step at a time through the fallen leaves, drawing closer. Then a vocalization, flat, calm, like someone articulating an Appalachian from a printed list. My integument became chillingly cold. Then again, Jamie. Then I perceived the ladder producing a creaking sound. Step by step, something was ascending. I clutched my bladed implement. My hands trembled with such intensity that I could barely maintain my grip. When the figure attained the apex, I did not wait to discern its facial features. I swung my foot forcefully. My specialized footwear struck it squarely in the thoracic region, and it fell backward. I heard the impact when it landed, then nothing. I dismounted from the rear of the stand. My ankle sustained a severe twisting injury upon impact. The discomfort was sharp, immediate, but I did not cease. I crawled, then limped through the arboreal expanse for several hours, devoid of direction, merely maintaining movement. Eventually, I discerned vehicular illumination. A transport vehicle was approaching, slowing down on an unpaved road. I stepped directly into its path. The driver forcefully engaged the braking system and exited the vehicle, vocalizing loudly. I collapsed by the frontal bumper. He inquired if someone was pursuing me. I merely nodded. I did not utter a single word concerning the instant photograph. The subsequent morning, I incinerated the instant photograph. I did not even glance at it again.